In this video, I'm going to go over some tips and tricks about how to read through psychology papers. Okay, so one of the main challenges when coming to primary research papers in psychology for the first time is that this will be new. And often what you'll find is that papers can be densely packed with information. Primary research papers are not written for a general audience, although you'll find that the more general and high impact the journal that the paper is in, the more kind of broad the writing is aimed at. It's aimed at a broader readership. But many primary papers will be really quite specific. They will assume a fair amount of knowledge. And because papers need to be short and concise, this means that the information can often be packed in quite densely. And it can take some time and some training to be able to go through this clearly and quickly. They also can use unfamiliar topics. You know, if you're new to the topic, or if you're new to psychology, then a lot of the terminology can be new, and this can be quite confusing. The best recommendation I can give for that is, as you're going through things, when you find new terms and so on, try to find the definition. Ideally, it should be provided in the paper, but like I say, in many papers they will assume certain knowledge of the area. So the best way might be to refer to textbooks or do a quick internet search. It might be interesting even to keep a document where, like a glossary, which you add to and expand over time. So as you come across new terms, you can add in your own understanding of these terms. That could be quite a useful thing to do. Now, with practice, going through primary papers and primary papers in psychology can get easier and faster. I, of course, can't teach that. I can't directly inject it into your brain, but I can give you some good tips to get going. And the following slides will do that. They all revolve around one core tip here, which is rather than to passively read from start to finish like you might read a book or a magazine article or a blog post, I would instead try to read actively. And the remainder of the slides will elaborate on exactly what this means. At the heart of it, though, is rather than just passively going through from start to finish, absorbing things like you might watch a TV program or a documentary, instead, you come to the paper with certain questions in mind. And at the beginning of the process of going through papers in psychology, you might have to try purposefully to keep these questions in mind. You might even want to write them down beforehand. And then your job, when it comes to reading the paper, is to get the answers to these questions. Now, of course, if you have questions revolving around the methodology or the theory or the conclusions, you don't need to read the whole paper to answer one of these questions. And so, in a way, reading actively is a way of chunking up a great big problem or great big task into a number of smaller tasks. So I'm going to go through a number of tips here. These are some example questions that you might pose to yourself or pose to the paper that you're reading. So let's start off with the introduction section. First off, it sounds rather obvious, but it's important to understand the general topic being addressed. Normally, you're picking up a paper for a reason. The title caught your eye, perhaps, and so you very well know what this paper is generally about. But sometimes you are being given a paper to read or to analyze and so on. And so the first thing is to familiarize yourself with the topic. What is the general issue at hand. This is very useful to set the scene in your mind. Another one really is to say, what have other people already discovered about this topic? Ideally, the answer to this question really should be included in the introduction to the paper. Now, authors of psychology papers vary quite wildly in their writing ability or writing clarity, but a good introduction will make this very clear. Nevertheless, it's important for you to pose this question to the paper. What is it that we already know? The next, relatedly, of course, is based upon what was already known. Oh man, I'm getting confused in my slides here. Based upon what was already known, how does this study address open questions? How does it follow on from previous research? So again, this might sound like a really simple thing, but if you were to passively read a paper and then someone asked you this question, it might not really come to you. But if you think about this question explicitly as you read the paper, or just go into the paper to answer just this question alone, then this is a much more active process. It's going to be much more available to your mind, and so it should speed up the process. This is a different question. So what is new about the study? Well, of course, what the authors did, what the question they asked is kind of like new because it follows on from earlier research. But that's not necessarily all of it. There could be lots of different new aspects to the paper, as well as the question being asked. That doesn't necessarily have to be new, in fact, but it could be a new question, or it could be an old question addressed in a new way. Maybe a previous paper addressed an issue, but the methodology was problematic, and maybe this new paper is using a more advanced methodology. So this is for you to find out, but clearly understanding and being able to describe how the study is novel is very useful, and that allows you to say, is this a kind of an interesting small increment in our understanding, or does it represent a large leap forward in our knowledge? Obviously, it's quite useful to know what the hypotheses were. So again, authors vary quite dramatically in the clarity to which they portray these. So in my mind, good introductions will kind of clearly state the hypotheses. This might be done in the form of a formal statistical hypothesis, but very often what you're presented with is a more higher level hypothesis. So what you might call a research question. And the research question in turn might be answered by conducting multiple statistical tests to examine different hypotheses, for example. Regardless, you need to know what the hypotheses or the research questions were. What about the methods section? I mean, there's an awful lot to say about the methods of a study, and this will very often be study specific. But in terms of general advice, an interesting thing to think about is, what are the characteristics of the participants? Was this study conducted upon psychology undergraduates? Was the study conducted on a special clinical group? Was the study conducted with kind of regular participants, but a questionnaire was maybe sent out to a special interest group? this raises questions in terms of selection bias. Also, if you have convincing or unconvincing outcomes of the study, you might ask yourself, well, do these generalize to other groups of participants, for example? Or might it be that there's something specific about the characteristics of the participants in this particular study which is special and doesn't generalize? Having a grasp of the methods that were used, I think, is quite important. Not just the big picture questions like, was this conducted in the lab on a computer, or was it a survey that was sent out to lots of people over the internet? If you can dig in a little bit further, of course, this very much depends on what the research question is. But if you can know what the methods are, you can get a sense of what the experiment or what the research was like for a participant, and that can often help you think about a study and whether it was done robustly, or if questions were perhaps posed to people in a way that might have been interpreted in a confusing manner, for example. Following on from that, getting a clear picture in your mind about what the participants actually did is really important. So this will mean you have to examine, what was the experimental design? How many different participant groups were there? Were there any participant groups, or was it just the same test or the same survey applied to everybody? How about the results section? This is often the most interesting one. But again, this comes down to the writing. It can sometimes be quite difficult to work out what results presented in the results section relates to what hypotheses. Good papers will make this quite clear, but very often it can take a bit of digging from you, the reader, to really understand this. And this is where note-taking can be really important. If you've written down and identified the list of hypotheses, it can be easy or useful to kind of sketch how the results relate to each particular hypothesis. Having some understanding of the analysis approach will also be beneficial. This is something that will come with time. If you're new to psychology, then I think it's really important to iterate that the analysis approach that people use in a study should be, is clearly influenced and should clearly relate to the experimental design that they used. So, for example, if you have a control group and a test group, and you're measuring people's heights or people's opinions about something, then you might expect, I am going to expect that a t-test might be used here. There could be other experimental designs where as soon as you've read that, you think, in order to test this, I'm expecting the authors to do a two-way ANOVA, for example. So this can be a really good way of learning, actually, to associate the experimental design that a paper has and the corresponding statistical test. If you make a prediction and then you see what was actually done, then you can kind of help yourself learn about analysis approaches. And bear in mind, what authors do in papers is not always the best thing. There are often multiple different ways of analysing the same data. I would also try to digest the statistical results. So the results section can often be incredibly concise and dry, and sometimes almost kind of painful to go through. And so in a way, the results section has to be kind of kept in your working memory as you're reading through the discussion section, which maybe digests the statistical results in a bit more detail or a bit more of an understandable way. Personally, I try to avoid this really concise and terse and unapproachable way of writing really concise results sections, and I try to put in not so much interpretation but more explanation with the results. Not every paper is going to do that, and so at the beginning you might have to try quite hard to understand, okay, what do these statistical results actually mean? And of course, that's going to be much easier to work out if you have a clear idea about what the hypotheses are. If you have made predictions about what analyses people are going to use based upon their questions and their experimental design, this process of working out what the results tell you is going to be less difficult and help your learning. So being able to write down and summarize what the results show you is going to be important. I'd also kind of think about, well, are these results consistent with previous research? Now, if you don't know much about the previous research, then you might not necessarily know that. That might be something that is dealt with more in the discussion section of the paper. Also, I think it's really important to focus quite heavily on the figures and the tables. Again, authors vary quite dramatically in how effectively they use figures and tables. I think that appropriate use of figures can be really insightful. You can convey an awful lot of information in some graphs or a summary table, like a table of summary statistics. That can be much more convenient and useful than trying to write it down in words. But different journals will have different limitations on the number of figures and tables that the authors can write. And so it's not always necessarily going to be presented easily to you. Another reason to try to kind of link the figures and the results, I think, is to, if you're trying to kind of explain or remember the results, that can often be much easier to do if you show someone the results in the form of their figure. Great. So the key thing is that, the authors should really do this in their discussion when they're talking about coming to certain conclusions and evaluating their hypotheses. What they should really be doing is specifying exactly what the evidence is that supports these hypotheses. Is it the statistical result, or is it the combination of a statistical result and the way how they may have demonstrated that in a figure? And so this is a good way of structuring your understanding and helping you evaluate if the results are convincing. So what about the discussion? I think this is a good place where the papers tend to kind of take a step back and interpret their results in the context of previous work. So one very obvious question to ask yourself when you're actively reading a paper is, does this paper agree with previous research in theory? Is it an improvement, or does it remain unconvincing? So you're probably unlikely to get authors telling you that their work is unconvincing, but this is part of the critical evaluation of a paper that you might do. Over time, at the beginning it can be quite difficult to critically evaluate a paper because they can be so kind of dense and technical and maybe sophisticated. As you start to develop a more trained eye, then you can start to critique these things and decide whether you personally are convinced by this evidence or not. Another good question: are there unexpected findings? If so, why did they occur? Could this be something genuinely new, which is true, or could it be some kind of byproduct? Are these unexpected findings caused by a change in methodology from a previous paper, or perhaps they have used a participant pool which is different from what other papers have done? I think being able to work out, well, whether the findings are important and whether you agree with that, that's a useful skill to have. So the forces at play in academic publishing are such that you never really want to kind of end a paper saying these results are kind of a bit boring and we shouldn't really have done the study. No one is really going to say that. So in general, people are going to try to emphasize the novelty and the profundity of their work. Now, sometimes people can get a bit carried away with that. Hopefully this is spotted in the review process of a paper. But again, it's up to you as your ability to critically evaluate papers develops, then you can think, are these findings important? Finally, you might want to think about the wider context of the research. So, are there important implications? There are many ways to kind of ask this question and to think about what implications might be. It could be something like, well, should we change kind of prescriptive advice on how we should teach children, for example? Should we change the advice that we have for people when they are dieting? These are examples of implications. And there are many different types of implications. And of course, some might be restricted to, well, simply researchers need to update what they think about a particular issue because this paper has been particularly insightful and maybe it's changing your mind. And so that would be like an academic implication of the research. Great. So that's pretty much it from me. So hopefully that was a useful summary of how to go through academic papers.